right. Jane, thank you so much for joining me today.
A pleasure to be here. Thank you, Dana.
So, I've known you for a long time, but not for all of your career in publishing. And so, if you could tell us all a little bit about your branding journey, where did you start and how did you get to where you are today?
I started working in publishing really from the start, like back in high school and college, where I worked on the school publications. And then once I graduated from college, I went straight into traditional publishing at a company called F&W, which is based in Cincinnati. And most people know me from my work at a very particular brand there, Writer's Digest, although I worked on a lot of different properties when I was at F&W. And my branding journey is interesting in that something that deeply scared me was how much my name was affiliated with the Writer's Digest brand, and that if I ever left that, I might have a problem. And I think it's still, I wouldn't say that it's a problem today, but there's definitely still that patina of me being from that background, and that has influenced a lot of course, how my career has developed today. But in any event, I realized, I would say in the mid 2000s, that if I wanted to have a career post F&W or post Writer's Digest, I needed to start creating a foundation for that and making my name as well known as the company that I worked for. And so that's when I started blogging. I got active on social media, and I was in this little bit of a perfect storm because as I made these decisions, like social media blew up and it became easier to create your own website without knowing code. And so I feel like I started moving in the right direction right when the tools became available.
And was this in 2007?
I would say, let's see, I bought my domain name in 2005. I got the site up in like what I would call a more formal way at the end of 2009. And then I did join Twitter at about the same time, about 2008. I joined Facebook in 2006. So yeah, you can see how it all starts to kind of build. Yeah.
Well, and I just think back to when I started the company in 2009 and trying to explain what Twitter was. It wasn't, the term follow wasn't in the zeitgeist yet. And it was this very creepy, weird thing that people were following you.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
and so you really got in at this pivotal time.
I did. Being an early adopter has benefited me in so many ways from a social media perspective. I would sometimes, people will ask for my advice about how to get started in social, and it's just not the same environment today. I wouldn't know. I feel a bit at a loss because and especially today when current events and politics are playing such a predominant role in how social media is used. Like, I feel like I came into it a very innocent time when there weren't so many like bad actors and concerns about privacy.
Absolutely. And so what would you identify before you identified as a part of Writer's Digest and a part of F&W? What would you consider your identity now when they say, "Hey, Jane Friedman, what do you do?" What is your kind of tagline or spiel that you give to people?
In my social media bios, I say I know too much about publishing. And I think that's kind of a shortcut to saying I know a lot about the industry, regardless of from what direction you approach it, from the author's direction, from the publisher's direction. I try to be a bridge between very different aspects of the publishing industry. So I don't consider myself on a traditional publishing side or on an independent or self-publishing side or print versus digital. I try to show people the piece of the picture that they might be missing and how to build a strategy that's right for them. And then I also have this funny kind of bridge that I try to build between the people who are more literary, people who are more commercial, and showing each side how to benefit from the strategies of the other. So I like to take the 360-degree view.
Well, and it seems like you, in your day-to-day, really follow your curiosity. You do a lot of research, you do a lot of reading to stay up to date on what's happening.
Yes, I love doing that. Like, I love to see the intricacies of the business playing out and understand the history of how certain decisions got made or how certain businesses have grown. So there are some people who get really uptight about, their writing as an art form, but I tend to get excited about publishing as a business.
Mm. And I also appreciate from one of your newsletter subscribers, I feel like you take all this big information that's so kind of lofty and a lot to sort through and distill it down into something that we all understand. And you kind of tell me, this is what is important of this whole lawsuit or this whole platform. Just focus on these key things. And I think it's a lot easier for people like me to digest.
Yes, I like to be accessible, or at Writer's Digest, when we talked about that brand, we talked about it as approachitative. So I think that part of the Writer's Digest brand has definitely stuck with me, trying to present things in a way that people get and can apply to their own career.
And especially in an age where there is so much information accessible. We have so much information at our fingertips. It's really hard to say what to trust, what to not trust, whose opinion do we listen to. And I think what you do really well is you present facts and less opinion. It's more about, here are the facts as we know them, and you can take the path that you feel is right for you.
Exactly, because I really try not to tell people this is the right answer, because so much depends on your goals and what you want to get out of this whole experience or business.
And so a lot of the listeners are writers, but also they're entrepreneurs who have thought about writing a book. And so one of the things I know you do is you help people with book proposals and coaching them through that process. Can you talk a little bit about what people at a very high level, we don't have hours and hours to talk about the process of publishing a book, but maybe talk a little about the process if they're thinking about publishing a nonfiction book or writing a novel, from point A, writing it, to point Z, is seeing it on the virtual shelf.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to nonfiction, I always try to encourage people to do the business plan first, because I think whether your success is so much driven by trends in the market and what your audience already has access to and how you're fitting on the shelf next to what they already can choose from. And this tends to be really important in areas like business, self-help, health, diet, like the really core nonfiction categories. There's a lot out there, and you have to figure out how you're going to distinguish yourself against other influencers or thought leaders or brands that are there. So I really push people to look at the competing titles and help let that inform the development of the project, rather than going at it in a vacuum. Like I'm gonna form this thing and I don't even know what's out there yet. For the fiction folks, it's the reverse. I try to get them to focus on completing the story to the best of their ability before they get too wrapped up in which agents or publishers or whomever is going to be appropriate, because your novel is going to sell based on the writing, and there's a certain amount of market appeal that's at play, but you have so little control over that. Like, you're not going to be able to know whether or not unicorns are popular in 2 years or if it's going to be mermaids. So like you just have to write the story that you're driven to write. Aside from those kind of process issues, patience is so key. Like, I don't know that everyone understands from a traditional publishing perspective how long it takes to get a book to market. So some people are expecting they'll get a book out in less than a year. But it's usually closer to 2 years, and it can take even longer than that.
Well, and I think that's especially relevant to the nonfiction authors who have, in a sense, been publishing for years. They have blogs, they have newsletters, they have podcasts. That's such instant gratification. Like, we're recording this probably a month before I hit publish, and it's out there, as opposed to writing a book and you're like, it's done, it's ready, it's edited, we have a cover art, let's go. And then the publisher still takes a year, sometimes more, to get it to market.
Right. And if you want the benefit of a traditional publisher, you want them to take that time. Like, they need that lead time to get to their accounts and to build, a place for it in the market and have success with all the stakeholders. So it's not something I recommend rushing if that's the right path for the book.
So can you speak a little bit about the differences between self-publishing and traditional publishing? I know that now there's a lot of what quote unquote hybrid publishing out there. And so if we can just, again, because a lot of these authors and entrepreneurs are probably inundated with information, can we deliver it in a, what's it called? what was the word that you used for Writer's Digest in a
Oh, approachitative.
approachitative way?
For traditional publishing, let's for the moment just assume like Big Five New York style, the most commercial publishing, where you want the big advance and the dream, where you have the potential to hit the New York Times list. That's what most people are probably thinking about when they're thinking about a traditional deal. You need a book and a concept that really deserves shelf space on every bookstore in the country. And, it's going to have really broad appeal, and you're probably going to have a platform. If you're a nonfiction author, you're going to have a platform to support that mass distribution. And so when you go to the publisher, you really have to be thinking, you have to have a concept that can stand up and deserve that nationwide attention and have the potential to get on morning shows or get the major newspaper magazine reviews, the Terry Gross interview, et cetera. Like, that's what traditional publishers want from their acquisitions, even though I must admit, there's a lot of throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. And it's a small percentage of books that reach that. Still, that's the vision. Self-publishing, I think, really benefits projects where you've already got your audience in your pocket. You're engaging with them consistently. You're not necessarily looking for that like kind of nationwide or even global splash. You're trying to accomplish something particular to a business goal or to an existing audience, and you don't need a publisher to reach that audience for you. Now, there are all sorts of gradations of this conversation we could get into based on genre and category. So like I have different ways of explaining this for a romance author than I do like a business person who's doing a business book. So I will say on the self-publishing side, I think it's really difficult to do that well when you're on the more literary end of the spectrum. Like, let's say you're a poet or a literary essayist, a short story writer, and you're trying to gain access to a particular literary club. Self-publishing probably isn't going to give you the keys to the kingdom unless you already have a really good, strong network of contacts. Instapoets accepted from that conversation because
I was just thinking about Rupi Kaur as you were saying that.
Which is a fascinating thing to talk about from a branding perspective. I mean, she's self-published, she's now traditionally published, but it shows the power of like engaging directly with your audience and how that can create demand for your work that catapults you.
Well, and it's interesting that you said that the poets and the literary essayists may have the most difficult time self-publishing, and yet it's also the most difficult genres and subgenres to get a traditional publishing deal in, which I find interesting. So it's just difficult all around, whereas it may be a little bit easier to have a commercial romance series, but it's also really easy to self-publish and do well in the romance genre.
Yes, so there's also issues of supply and demand, and there's just a lot more demand for romance than there is for short story collections.
Can we talk a little bit about that supply and demand, especially when it comes to the nonfiction business self-help space? Are you seeing an increase of demand and also supply? What are you seeing in that space?
I'm seeing increasing publishing on both sides. So if you look at some of the latest industry trends, and I was just at London Book Fair and heard some really interesting information on this. Self-improvement is really big right now. And part of this is driven by politics and the desire to like look at some part of your life maybe that you can control and develop. But then, of course, on the flip side of that, there are the books that are about the world we live in and dealing with that. So you see, of course, books on current events and politics growing. And then aside from the self-help and business categories or self-improvement, cooking and other books relating to the environment are also growing. So this has been what's considered it's turning into a long-term trend, meaning it's not just this past year or two, it's like extending into 3 years, 5 years. So whether you're interested traditionally or in self-publishing, you're going to see growth, opportunity, and also competition. Some of the books, they mention specific keywords that are super prevalent right now in the 2019 titles that are about to come out, things like mindfulness, happy, calm, That kind of gives you a sense of where people's heads are.
So it's interesting, like when you talk about, again, unicorns and mermaids as being a very short-term trend, the political nature books is a little bit of a moderate length
Yeah.
trend. And then the cookbooks and environment is a longer trend. So you
Yeah.
could, in theory, still write for the market or consider that market because it's going to be around in 3 or 4 years.
Yes, yes. And in fact, it's the cookery thing in the UK, they call it cookery. Uh, there's more growth in appliance cooking, so like the air fryers and the instant pots and things of that nature, as well as vegan and vegetarian cooking. Again, I think that's connected to concerns about the environment and global warming. So if you're looking at the headlines, you can kind of understand where some of this is coming from. Which, if you're writing nonfiction, you should have, hopefully you're plugged in somehow into the concerns of your community, whether that's through social or conferences or whatever your readership reads, you should be reading.
I feel like you're like a publishing sociologist or like a anthropologist, because it is so much with any market. It has to do with the world around us, and if we're not tuned in, we can miss out on some things. Yes. I think that your point about the environment, I think, is incredibly true, because I think I've seen a lot more, again, sustainable living, focuses on eco-friendly products. Our friend who was on the show a few weeks ago, Sarah Von Bargen, who does the No Grocery Challenge, like part of it ties into budget, because she talks a lot about budgeting, but it's also about how much food is wasted. And so 1 week per month, she skips grocery shopping and tries to just use up everything in her fridge or pantry. Yeah. So I feel like that's really how that impacts the books that are coming out is really interesting.
It is.
And going back, not to make this a dispatch from London Book Fair, but what are some of the things in terms of how we are reading, whether it's or print, or I know audio continues to be on the rise. What are you noticing in terms of formats?
Audio is the thing that everybody talks about everywhere around the world. Like, you can't get away from it. They're now developing programming tracks at every industry event to tackle the opportunity. And also, like, there's a challenge there in that the growth has been so fast that it's hard to find talent, because they're all tapped out. Like, everyone's busy, their schedules are full. So in any event, there's much more interest right now in audiobooks outside of the usual categories that do well. So the usual categories are, fiction, crime, science fiction and fantasy, especially thriller. It's now starting to spread into children's and nonfiction, and even shorter form children's and nonfiction. If you look at outside of that, in terms of print versus it's kind of flatlined now from a traditional publisher's perspective. It's just been in a holding pattern of about 25% the rest print, with audio kind of shoved in there at about 5% of the overall market. So yeah, I think what was surprising, well, I don't know if I should call it surprising, but young adult has kind of leveled off in this sort of heat that's been behind it since, I don't know, the early 2010s. I think it was super hot and growing. Now the growth is happening in YA nonfiction more so than fiction. And also looking at the children's market in particular, nonfiction is growing just as it is in the adult market. So just more, if I look more big picture at the trends, nonfiction is where a lot of the excitement is, that's where the growth is. And it's true in children's and adult both.
Well, and that seems to fall in line with what you were saying about us trying to get a handle on current events, that the teens who are living in a very confusing time may also want to do the same.
Right. Yes.
So how is this impacting your own writing, publishing, consulting? How have you changed your approach in the past few years, or are you continuing to coach on the same things? How has this changed?
Well, I've certainly felt more pressure to do audio format of anything and everything. Fortunately, my publisher has done an audio edition of my latest book, but I have resisted so far doing any type of podcast. I'm totally satisfied going on wonderful podcasts like yours and being a guest. But it's still, of course, in the back of my mind, do I need to be thinking, like, because right now everyone's talking so much about voice assistants, so like a Siri and Alexa and some of these other things, and how we're going to be depending more on those to find what we're going, find experts, find entertainment, find information. So,
If you
I'm
look
letting.
up if you look up voice first, the hashtag on Instagram, you'll see so much about voice assistants and how we need to create SEO for voice, not just for the Google crawlers. I've gone down that rabbit hole. It's a very interesting topic to tackle.
It is. I'm letting that, I'm just ruminating on that. I'm not taking any specific actions. I'm still just very much focused on the core of my business, which is sharing evergreen information to the best of my ability through my site. That's still the number one way that people find me, is through the site. And I've found that email has been critical as social media has become really iffy in terms of its reach, or organic reach. Email has saved my bacon, like, because people still subscribe, they don't drop off, it keeps growing. And I am so glad that years ago I had the foresight to allow people, for instance, to subscribe to my blog, like on a weekly digest or a daily, because like, even though people say blogs are dead, they're not dead if you can email them to folks.
That's
So
absolutely true.
that's just been so satisfying to see that pay off.
So it's something we preach all the time, is how email marketing is so crucial and you need a newsletter list, and that doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. Can
No.
you talk a little bit about, other than delivering really great content on a very consistent basis in a very consistent format, are there other things that you're doing to amplify your email marketing?
I am probably the laziest marketer you will ever have on your show. And part of that's just because my brand is at a point now where I have all the business I want. And so it's not creating pressure to do new and innovative things. I would say and this isn't innovative of all, but the most recent thing I did was create a private Facebook group for people who have read the book, my latest book, or who just kind of find me or realize the group exists, they can join too. And I've found that's been a more reliable way of marketing things. And I've done Facebook live chats within that group. And so it's something that it's like an investment that I'm making in the long term. I don't have a particular point to it as of yet. And yeah, aside from that, I think Hot Sheet is where I've been focusing more of my attention, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, but it's a paid subscription newsletter. And so that's where a lot of my industry insights and research, it all goes into that. And our marketing for that is very much focused on partnerships. So partnering with author organizations and others who reach the author community, rather than doing anything that would be socially driven or advertising driven.
Mm-hmm. We can talk about Hot Sheet. Let's dive into it. So what's Hot Sheet, and how does it differ from your personal weekly newsletter?
So Hot Sheet comes out every 2 weeks, which makes it very different from the other newsletters that I do. And it's basically a long read. So you would spend maybe 30 minutes, maybe up to an hour, depending, reading this issue. It has 5 pieces in it, every issue, plus links of interest, where we share other stories that we didn't cover, ourselves, but we think might be of interest to writers. And it's really about keeping your awareness of what's happening in the industry, keeping it high, but not freaking out when there are changes, like when Amazon jiggles the algorithm and everyone feels like their sales goes up in flames, and there are Facebook outbreaks, panic outbreaks. Like, what we try to do in the newsletter is present changes in a more long-term context, what you might need to do in the short term, but like framing everything about long-term issues and how you might be adjusting. So yeah, it's both information and analysis. We try to put everything. I have a partner on it, Porter Anderson, who works with me on that, and we try to keep it calm. It's supposed to be thoughtful analysis. So that's every 2 weeks. And then my other newsletters, it's the blog content, or it's digital tools and resources. So it's much more quick. I wouldn't It's more disposable, I might say, than Hot Sheet. Although certainly with Hot Sheet, because it's based on news and developments, you know, you probably wouldn't want to be reading back issues more than a year because something new will have happened to have made that other information obsolete.
Yeah. And I've been subscribing for a while now, and I like how, whereas other industry newsletters like Publishers Weekly or Shelf Awareness, like you said, it's very like quick hit highlights and also just like links to other articles. I appreciate the longer form analysis of, well, here's what happened, and here is this compilation of what we think how it affects you and why.
Yeah.
And there's even, if we're getting extra lazy about it, you guys always have a bottom line at the end. So if I'm in a really busy time, I can just like scroll through the 5 bottom lines and say, okay, got it. That's
Right.
me, yep. Or even decide if I want to read that article more in depth.
Right.
So I really appreciate the options. And I treat it like a magazine, like a subscription that would arrive in my mailbox instead it arrives in my inbox.
Exactly. Yep.
So can we talk a little bit about the model of a paid newsletter and a paid subscription, and why you decided on that, how you decided on that, how it works? I think there may be some people listening who may be curious about that model.
Yeah, there is kind of a resurgence right now in paid email newsletters, although maybe I shouldn't call it resurgence, since I don't know if it ever existed before, but just in the idea that you can pay for content. I think that's the resurgent idea, that people might actually subscribe and pay for their content online. So there are now services, although Hotsheet doesn't use it, like Substack, that allows you to very easily set up a newsletter that people can get for free, they can pay for, some combination thereof. In fact, there's a great newsletter to check out if you're curious about this model, kind of the in-between model, called Amazon Chronicles by Tim Carmody. I pay $5 a month to receive it, but anyone can get it for free. So you can have your cake and eat it too. I think that it's become a popular way for journalists in specialized areas and niches to monetize their expertise in a way that helps fill in the gaps of their income, especially if they're freelancing. Their income might not be very reliable from month to month. So this provides them that cushion. It also provides them with just a direct-to-reader currency that can be valuable over the long term. The reason I pursued it has a bit of a history. Like, I had tried launching a digital magazine called Scratch with a different partner prior to the Hot Sheet. And even though I'm really fond of that effort, like, we made some poor business decisions and it didn't last more than a couple years. So with Hot Sheet, I kind of got to rethink and problem solve. And since that didn't work out, what would I need to change to make this survive longer and be more feasible from a business perspective? So I think we got it right this time. It's in its 4th year. So, and it's very sustainable.
Are you open to talking about some of the changes that were made and some of the differences between the two?
Yeah, so Scratch was delivered in an app, an iPhone app, and also through a website that had a paywall. And if you subscribed, you could access it either way. And we also offered a PDF version, which we found was helpful for people who wanted to use it in the classroom. And we weren't app developers, me and my partner. We used a third-party startup that went out of business. And we also used a payment processor that went out of business. So when you're working with other startups who are on, kind of shaky ground, that affects your longevity. And so once those companies started to falter, it just made it very hard to move forward. We also didn't charge enough. So we were charging $20 for a year, and it just wasn't enough money to split. And I think we could have gotten more, although we did take donations and people willingly gave. So Hot Sheet, I was very determined not to choose technology that would be pulled out from under us. And so we use a system that administrates subscriptions. It's called ChargeBee. And if we needed to, we could export all that information and go to another administrative provider if we had to. And then MailChimp delivers the email itself. And I don't think MailChimp's going anywhere. And it's also just greatly simplified. Like, we're just going to give it to you in an email. And if you don't like it, don't subscribe. Like, we're not going to bend over backwards to provide it in 3 formats. This is it. This is what it is.
Yeah. And I think that if you try to make everyone happy, you'll make no one happy. We poll our audience quite frequently, and I'll say, what kind of content do you like to see? Do you like a newsletter? Do you like YouTube? And it gets split in every which way. And so if people want the content, they'll deal, yeah. I find.
Yes.
And I think that this model is interesting because it seems like the other model was you can pay or you can donate. There's different things you can do. And what I like is the hot sheet is very clear cut. Like, it costs money, sign up, pay money.
Yes. Yes. There is so much to be said for simplifying.
Well, and I think that's some of the tricky part with like things like Patreon, where I'm a patron for a few things. And if it's very simple if you want the ad-free podcast, you do a patron. If you want ads in your podcast, you don't. It's just like Hulu or whatever else. And so the more you can simplify what the benefits are, I think the more clear people are and the more likely they are to sign up.
Yes.
You talk a little bit about working with a partner. I know Porter and I adore him. How did you guys connect? How is that business set up? What's it like? Because I know a lot of us are solopreneurs or sole proprietors. And so what is it like to work with a partner?
We met initially through Twitter. This was back when I think I was still doing like the Writer's Digest blog, Best Tweets for Writers series. So this is going back like 9 years, maybe longer. And he used to send me tips for what I ought to include in that roundup, which nobody ever did. And I'm like, who is this guy?
Smart networker. That's who he is. Very smart networker.
Yeah. And we met each other at a writing conference, and he was live tweeting a storm. And so when someone's but he wasn't like creepy or stalkerish. And he wasn't really asking anything of me. He was trying to be helpful. And so that led to him writing occasionally for my site. And so just through the process of getting to know each other and also having similar interests, I'm trying to remember, I think the time that we started Hot Sheet, I want to say that he was writing for The Bookseller, which is the UK equivalent to Publishers Weekly. And then after that, he ended up being editor-in-chief, which he still is editor-in-chief of Publishing Perspectives, which is another industry publication. So he's out there looking at the industry side really closely and from a global perspective. And so he's in touch with a lot of the players. And then I have the writing community emphasis and connection, the author connection. So it's a nice match of expertise. And, we both, work from our respective home offices, and we mainly use private Twitter messages back and forth for content planning. And we do everything through a Google Doc. And, it's like we've been working together a long time now. So you reach a comfort level, and we have an outside copy editor who goes through the whole issue before we publish. So that helps also take away some of the burden of having to, edit each other or be responsible for making those final calls.
And do you split the business 50-50? Like, you both have 50% ownership?
That's right. Yeah.
Wow. That's really, you have to trust the person. It's more than just working together. It's making business decisions together.
Yes. Yes. So there's when you disagree in a 50-50 relationship, that can certainly cause tension. But I think we're pretty respectful of where each other's expertise lies and knowing when to kind of back down.
I think that that's really key. I learned that a little. I co-chair a writers conference, and when I took on a partner to do it, I knew I needed somebody, right? I can't operate and do that scope of work in a bubble. But Lori Rader Day, who is a mystery author, she was head of MWA Midwest. She's now head of Sisters in Crime Midwest. So she has all these connections with authors that are outside of my purview. And so she was bringing a very specific talent to the table. And she also reads a lot of cozies and traditional mysteries, and I'm more on the thriller, creepy side. And so we were a good balance, but it was a difference in, this is not a benevolent dictatorship anymore. This is, we have
Right.
mutual, we have 50-50 stake. And so I think all of our conference in Nahachi is the better for it, obviously, but I think
Yeah.
it's an adjustment for many of us who are operating at the top.
Yeah. I think in my career, this, just going back to the very beginning, I think, you know, my philosophy is hell is other people, which I don't mean like in a bad sense, but that is always where the most difficulty lies. And so, like for those who are listening, like I would not enter into a partnership lightly with anybody. And I'm speaking as someone who came like the Scratch magazine partnership. I mean, it ended amiably enough, but there were like some radical disagreements that made me question whether I should be in a partnership at all.
Mm.
So yeah, you have to, yeah, be cautious.
It's like a bad breakup when you go through that. It's like a
Yeah,
divorce.
it is. I think it's worse.
Oh,
Having been through a divorce, I think
oh
it's worse.
well, it's
Uh,
because you have a child together, right? That's the difference, is that the business is the baby and you're splitting it apart.
Indeed.
So we have to wrap up soon, but I want to just touch on a couple more things for people getting into publishing, getting into self-publishing, finishing their books and ready to enter the marketplace. What are some things that you see authors doing that are terrible ideas and that you just want to shake them and say, stop doing that? And then on the flip side, what are some things that you see authors doing, or publishers doing for that matter, that are really working and that you want to see more of?
And this is for self-publishing
Both,
or both.
either. If you want to just stick to self-publishing, that's totally
No,
fine.
no, it's true that a lot of the mistakes that I think of apply to all authors regardless. From a marketing, publicity, and branding perspective, I think many authors are trying to just follow really conventional wisdom that's sometimes quite old, like, oh, I better start blogging, or I better start tweeting or getting on Facebook. And some of this advice that they're receiving is actually from their agent or their publisher, which makes it hard to say, oh, your publisher's wrong or your agent's stupid. But sometimes I don't think publishers and agents even know what they're saying when they tell an author, oh, you should start tweeting or you should get on Instagram. That is not helpful advice. And so I often end up counseling authors who've been given this really terrible advice to just get on social and start doing whatever you do there to market your book. But it's a very short-term way of thinking, and you have to be on these social media communities for usually years prior to your book releasing for it to be a meaningful part of the launch.
And it needs to be
So
intentional. It needs to be very, I am here to do this thing. I equate it to like my grandma telling me I should get married. Like, that's not advice. That's not helpful at all. Help me sign up for a JDate profile and then we can start talking about it. But I think it's this idea of like, oh, you should just do that. Someone, told me like, oh, you should do a TED Talk. I'm like, that's not helpful. It's not advice. It's just, you should do something and then go do that. There's no strategy behind it. There's no purpose behind it. And when people don't understand the why or what they're doing, they're not going to be able to do that effectively.
exactly. So that begs the question of, well, what should I do instead? Like if I know that my audience, let's say you're writing a YA book and like most of your people are on Instagram, let's say, and you've never been on Instagram, what do you do? And I mean, sure, you can join and start taking some steps, but I think you need to start borrowing other people's platform, basically. So, trying to reach out and do good work around the people who have something established there, building relationships with those people, which is a long game. Like you can't just go and make demands or insert yourself into the conversation in a way that makes you look like you're badgering them. But doing a really wise, if possible, influencer campaign or reaching out to those whose platform you can borrow is usually what I recommend if you know that you're coming up short in the communities where you need to be. And I've seen that done well. So I think some authors have been able to do that.
Well, and I think it goes back to just networking,
Yeah.
even. right?
Yeah.
The Porter Andersons who are helping other people out by tweeting them tips, or
Right.
we were going to start working with an author, and when I was doing her proposal, I was looking through her Instagram, and her Instagram is photos with other authors where she's going to their book signings and buying their book, and has a photo of her holding their book, and guess
Right.
what's getting reposted and,
Yes.
and retweeted. It being a literary citizen is the best form of networking.
It is. And I think networking is kind of, it turns into sometimes a scary or intimidating phrase or word for people, but it's really just about, as you said, being a good literary citizen and and sharing and other people's works, showing your enthusiasm for it and not just expecting you're going to sit in a vacuum and everyone's going to everyone's going to come support you when you have never supported anyone else ever.
Which is what I think people expect, especially when they sign up with a traditional publisher. I think they think this, oh, they're going to do it all. But
Yeah.
that's not the case. You're still the talent. You're still having to hit the road and meet your fans and network and do all those things.
Exactly. Yeah. And you just touched on another big mistake that or problem area that people have, which is like the most disappointment for authors comes not from getting rejected, but from actually seeing that their book's on the shelf and no one knows it's there. That's the moment of reckoning.
Mm. And so what do you do with those authors that you work with? Who do your authors have that moment, or they don't because they worked with you throughout the process?
I would say a good half of my clients end up on my doorstep after the book is released and they're like, nobody noticed. Now what?
Mm.
That's a hard conversation to have. I mean, it depends on the book, what it is that you can do. I never think it's too late. Um, but usually I encourage people don't focus too much on what this book did or didn't accomplish right out of the gate. Maybe your next best move is to think about the next work you have if you're going to be a multi-book author. Like it's not a make it or break it thing on this single title. I know there's all of the talk about if you have a bad sales track record, you're doomed. I don't think that's as true as people say. um, so yeah, I think it's really sad for me when I meet someone who can't let go of that book that didn't go where they wanted it to. And at some point you have to.
And I think that nothing sells your first book like another book, right? Like
Right.
when I'm assuming when your new book came out that Publishing 101 got a bump.
It did. Yes.
Right.
So your earlier books, everything that you do that's available gets a really nice halo effect surrounding it. So
And I think that's really good that you have this. I like hearing this attitude of it's not too late, because I definitely feel when we get inquiries from authors who are like, my book came out 2 months ago and nothing's happening and now I need to hire a publicist. I'm like, no, call us in 6 months when your new book is going to come out. And right now just focus on the new book. But in terms of nonfiction, I think the other focus is very few authors make their living off of one book.
right.
Like I can, probably 0.0001% earn that living off of one book. It's all about the next book or the e-courses or the speaking. It's not
Right.
about that one thing.
Right. Exactly. And for nonfiction authors, there's usually so much content marketing that can be done where you don't have to be worried about how old the book is, just that you're finding new ways to reach the target readers, doing more experiments or building an audience for the next thing that you write.
Mm. So before we finish up, you had a number of books come out. You've been on both sides of traditional and self-publishing. Can you throw in a couple of things you're really glad that you did, and then a couple of things that you may have done differently?
I'm really happy that I self-published Publishing 101. It's not something that I actually went into enthusiastically. In fact, I can't even recall what motivated me to do it other than the sense that I need a book. And I'm so like at that point in my career, this was in 2014. I don't want to say that I was anti-book, but I was like, there's so many other things I could be doing that are interesting and don't require this time and effort and that are better paying. Like I do not care. But I just felt like there were so many people asking, and I didn't have books at conferences where I was speaking, and I thought I just need to knuckle down and do it. And so I'm really glad that I did, because it did have a really measurable effect. And I get a lot of clients that way, of course. And it just, regardless of how the book is published, having it out there, if it looks reasonable, like if you've done a reasonable job with the design and the packaging and the content, it's going to have a positive effect, even if the sales aren't what you want. So from a branding perspective. So I'm really happy about that. As far as mistakes, book-wise, I don't feel like I've had a big miss as of yet. Like certainly with the University of Chicago, there was the potential for some things to happen that fortunately didn't happen. Like there was a disagreement over the cover, but we resolved it. I was going to be very unhappy if they didn't do an audio edition. And it did take a year, but it's now out.
I just got the announcement in your newsletter that it's out.
So certainly there has been potential for some negatives, but I've been a little bit lucky, I would say.
Well, and when you're coming from a standpoint of being highly knowledgeable in this area, the luck kind of swings in your favor, I think.
It does. Yeah.
Did you narrate the audiobook?
No. And in fact, here's a nice traditional publishing story. I didn't even know it was coming out until I saw it myself on Amazon.
Oh my gosh. So you didn't hear the samples? You didn't audition? Wow.
No. So someone else has narrated it. I haven't even listened. She looks like a great person. Like she's won awards. Like I have no question about the quality, but it certainly would have been nice to at least know it was coming.
Hilarious.
Yeah.
You're not the only one. I was on a call with a potential client and he was saying how he didn't think there was a date yet set for his paperback. He's like, I don't know if they're doing a paperback. I was like, well, it's listed on Amazon as coming out in 6 months. He's like, what? Do you even know? They don't tell you things.
Yeah.
Another benefit of self-publishing, you have full control and knowledge over where everything is happening.
Yeah. There's still definitely things that Chicago did where if I were doing it, I would change it. But like, you have to pick your battles.
Mm-hmm. Well, I will say your cover came out beautifully for that one.
I think it did. Yeah, I'm very happy.
Yeah. And I will definitely check out the audiobook. I have been very audio curious as of late. We have one of our authors is narrating. She wrote a memoir and she's narrating her own audiobook. And I just got the audiobook rights back to your book, Your Brand. And everyone's saying I should narrate it. And then I asked Nicole, my wife, what she thinks. She's like, yeah, you should pay someone else to do it. So now I'm like, So this has been high on my mind, especially as you said, audio, even though it's only 5% of the market, it's still quickly on the rise.
It is, and it's more dollars. So the dollar growth is significant.
Do you have an audiobook for the business for Publishing 101?
I don't. And I think that's one of kind of a missing piece. Like I mentioned, I didn't want to necessarily get into podcasting, but I would love to offer audio editions of my blog posts. And one reason Publishing 101 is essentially a compilation of everything that's on my site. So I don't know that I do an audio edition for that. But I would love to do more audio of the short form. It's just a matter of time.
Absolutely. And I will say that that's how this got started. This podcast got started was I was just going to record audio versions of the blog posts. And then we got requests for people to join as guests and people wanted to hear from other people. And so it just kind of expands. I think the thing that got me was a stat that came out, it's probably 6 or 8 months ago now, that the majority of something like 90% of podcast listeners listen to the whole show.
Wow.
And that got me because how many of us read blog posts where we skim and don't read the whole thing, or newsletters where we just kind of get the highlights. But if I think to my own listening, yes, I almost always listen to the entire podcast. So if I want people to hear the entire piece, the entire content, then an audio version of that is probably the way to do it. And so as a little gift to our listeners, we are giving away a subscription to the Hot Sheet. And so we will be linking to it in the show notes, but if you go to brandingoutsidethebox.com/hotsheet, you'll have the show notes, the episode, and a place to enter to win a free subscription. So thank you so much, Jane. It was so informative. And where would you like people to connect with you after the show?
Best place is janefriedman.com. That's where you can find all my social media links and my contact form, and also links to Hot Sheet and my books and all of that.
Fantastic. And we'll link to that in the show notes as well. Thank you so much for, as always, for all of your wisdom and insight. I know everyone's going to appreciate it.
Thank you, Dana. It's a lot of fun to talk with you.